Hi, everyone, audience of the American Library in Paris. I am Rachel Donadio, the administrator of the American Library in Paris Annual Book Award, and I'm very pleased to be speaking now with J.P. Daughton, the author of one of our shortlisted titles, In the Forest of No Joy, which is about the Congo-Océan Railroad. Thanks for joining today, J.P.
Thank you for having me.
So this is an intense book about a French colonial chapter about the railroad that was built from Brazzaville to the Atlantic coast from 1921 to 1934. And in between those dates, there's a lot of misery. Tell us a little bit about what is going on in this book and kind of what the origins of the story are for you.
Right, how I came about about it. I mean, I'm a colonial historian, so I guess I have a kind of interest, for better or for worse, with dark subjects. I mean, with oftentimes rather difficult and brutal subjects. And I've been working on colonialism for about 15 years when I was at an archive in France, in Roubaix in the north. And I came across this file on the Congo-Océan that had photographs in it of both sort of French engineers and also African workers who were building a railroad that I had sort of vaguely heard about that, kind of gets a line or two oftentimes in textbooks, but not much more than that. And the photographs were just both so bizarre in how different they were. They were both photos of kind of, colonial officers in nice white pressed suits, and then also African workers who were, looked broken, looked semi-starved. And I started to wonder just how it is that a world like this could have existed. And there was a way in which I felt that the photos were really kind of speaking to me on a human level. And then, I dug more and more into the story of the Congo-Océan and was really just fascinated both by the kind of passion that French authorities had for building it, and also the utter horrors that went into actually constructing it. So
tell us, this is a railroad that went from inland to the coast, and how did this railroad come about, and how did the French colonial authorities enlist or almost, drag into this some 42,000 African workers to do the work here?
Yeah, so the Congo River is this hugely rich, kind of expansive set of rivers that flow through the interior of Africa. And it's navigable, but only down to Brazzaville, which is at the head of some kind of falls, essentially. So the French had been trying to develop equatorial Africa, and they could move goods from all around this region, a region about the size of India, to Brazzaville, but they couldn't get goods to the coast. So really from the earliest period of exploration, there was this belief from the 1880s, 1890s, that they had to have a railroad that would connect Brazzaville to the coast. So there were years and years in which they kind of debated how to go about doing this, how to find a route. I mean, even that was very difficult because it goes through this mountainous area that's extremely treacherous, that has horrible weather. And ultimately in the 1920s, they got funding from France to start building it. So it was always seen as kind of an answer to how to develop the colony, it was portrayed as how to enrich the natives, right? The Africans. But it also certainly was key to trying to develop French trade in the area.
It was all intertwined. I mean, France wanted businesses to invest in this colonial undertaking. And so there was an economic benefit in addition to the mission civilisatrice, the idea that we're making bringing culture to the natives.
Exactly, yeah.
And so why was this such a brutal undertaking? Under what conditions did the French colonial authorities enlist these 42,000 people? And in this book it's very intense. A lot of nameless African workers die of dysentery and other diseases and, really grim conditions, which you found out about, I guess, in the archival research.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that while there was a lot of will on the side of the French to build the railroad, they were completely ill-prepared, ill-equipped to do it. This was going to be a kind of engineering feat in any circumstance, just because the countryside that the railroad went through was very difficult. The French Congo, or French Equatorial Africa itself, is a relatively sparsely populated country. So there were not many workers or African, men who could be recruited who lived near the railroad. So very quickly, having worked through this group of sort of local workers, they had to go far and wide to find workers. And they actually went as far as Chad, on the edge of the Sahara, to find workers. And as you can imagine, workers were interested, potential workers were interested in being villagers. They were interested in their own lives. They didn't want to go 1,000 miles across land to work on this railroad. So there was extraordinary resistance. And as a result, the colonial government basically doubled down and simply started to intimidate and coerce men, mainly men, there were some women as well, into joining the effort. There was always this rhetoric of, the African needs to help out the colony, for sure. But Africans felt like they had very little invested in this entity that was to them foreign, that was to them, a bunch of essentially, crazy white colonizers who had sort of arrived. So the methods that the French end up using are quite brutal. Kidnapping, oftentimes, there are cases in which villages were rounded up, women and children were imprisoned until men would come forward and volunteer. They were always called volunteers, but it was clearly coercion.
And this was just, and you learned about this in the archival research. There were accounts of this.
There were, yeah. There are definitely some in French, older articles that talk about the Congo-Océan. I think that what they don't do, and what I discovered in the archives, they don't really go into what the experiences of the African population was in the building of the railroad. And once I started to dig in the archives in France and in the Republic of Congo, I started to come across a lot of stories, accounts by French colonial officials themselves. And also there are these travelers who kind of go through. André Gide is one who travels through. Albert Londres, who's kind of he's more or less, he's better known in France for sure. He's more or less forgotten, I think, in the United States, was kind of a George Orwell kind of traveling journalist of his era. And these people all wrote accounts, and they were kind of the beginning, I guess, of my archival reconstruction to try to find other stories, other examples. And really, if I looked closely, if I dug through enough papers, I found a remarkable amount of information about the oftentimes extraordinarily brutal methods that the colonial government used.
And these initial accounts by André Gide went as a journalist effectively at that stage, right, of his life, and then Albert Londres, and they talked about some of these miserable conditions too in their accounts.
They do. Gide actually was traveling. Gide had this great fondness for Joseph Conrad, and I think fancied himself kind of following in the footsteps of Conrad, doing his great African trip. And he almost by accident came across a case of recruitment for the Congo-Océan. A man actually saw Gide's car, which was unheard of in the region that he was in, driving by, and followed Gide to sort of tell Gide. He thought Gide, the story goes, he thought Gide was maybe the governor general of the colony. And he tells Gide all about the sort of horrors that are going on in that region. And it's through that Gide learns of the kind of atrocious methods to use to get workers.
And did those accounts have an effect on raising people's awareness of what the colonial project was ultimately, what was happening? Where were we kind of hearts and minds understanding of the French colonial experience at this time?
Right. So, aside from the kinds of horrific experiences that workers have, a large part of the story really of the book is about how oftentimes these reports would come out. Gide wrote to the colonial administration, he wrote a book Londres had a series in a newspaper in France, and they became kind of brief, affairs, brief scandals. But they didn't really have lasting power. And one of the reasons why they didn't have lasting power is that the colonial regime, and particularly the governor general, who was this man named Raphael Antonetti, the colonial regime just pounced on these stories and undermined them, denied them, refused them, rejected them, oftentimes hounded the writers. I mean, Londres and others were cast, kind of cast as anti-patriotic, un-French, this sort of thing. And what really struck me is the extent to which colonialism, critiques of colonialism really had remarkably little traction in France, particularly in the interwar period. So they didn't really have much legs, even though they inspired some on the left and sort of fed a kind of anti-colonial discourse, but it certainly was a very minor kind of story.
It would take longer. And again, the dates of this railroad are 1921 to 1934. So right in the middle of that, of the interwar period. You talk about two of the colonial administrators, Albert, wait, say it again, Albert.
No, it's Raphael Antonetti.
Antonetti, sorry, yeah. Antonetti. Yeah. And then also, of course, Pierre Savrognan de Brazza, who gives his name to Brazzaville. Quite a character. Tell us a little bit about them and what their lives were in this colonial undertaking.
Right. They actually, it's funny, they're both of Italian ancestry, right? I mean, Brazza was a born Italian and naturalized. Antonetti actually is this kind of weirdly nebulous character where even looking at his biography, you don't really know where he's from. Some said he was from Malta, some said he was from Corsica. Others said he was from, just from France itself. But Brazza was the first to kind of explore in the region as a European. He's the first to kind of make contact with local groups to try to basically stake a claim for France. He'd become a naturalized citizen at that point. And he very much in the 1880s portrayed himself as this great humanist, this great kind of man of peace. There's this famous photograph of him by the photographer Nadar, in which he's dressed really almost as like a homeless, wandering mystic, right? In sort of baggy clothes. He's barefoot. He has a staff, not the kind of masculine colonial conqueror that you would imagine. And he tried to establish, or claimed to try to establish, a kind of peaceful colonial regime in which, everyone would benefit. I mean, this was very much the era of the high point of the mission civilisatrice. By the 1920s, they needed a kind of hard-pushing bureaucrat to make sure that this railroad could be built. And they got this Antonetti, who was really a kind of lifelong bureaucrat within the colonial administration, who had extraordinary passion. I mean, passion, obsession, building this railroad, and went to unbelievable ends. I mean, one of the most striking things for me in the archives was the just thousands and thousands of pages of reports and letters and comments and so forth that Antonetti, created. But Antonetti, unlike Brazza, who I think, had this kind of flair for charisma and so forth, Antonetti was clearly, everyone who met him said he was boring. He was kind of unmemorable. He was not interested in African society. He was not terribly interesting. I mean, the photos of him make him look very much like a kind of, fonctionnaire. I mean, no offense to fonctionnaire out there, I guess, but fonctionnaire in that kind of, late 19th, early 20th century mold.
But the boring bureaucrats can be the most dangerous in a way.
Absolutely, and certainly is the case in this story.
You talk about the things that surprised you in the archives, and also these photos that you came across, which are of these enlisted African workers. And I don't know if I can easily hold one up on the Zoom, but under what circumstances were they taken, and what was the aim of them? To just go back to colonial headquarters and here,
Well, actually, the photographs many of the photographs in the book, and the photographs that I first found in the archives that really spoke to me seem to be kind of private photos that were taken for the Batignolles, this company that was hired, the engineering company that was hired to build a large portion of the railroad. And, one of the things that really surprised me and kind of intrigued me is that the photos themselves look a lot like photos that you might see for a campaign for people who are starving to death, right? A kind of humanitarian vision. But it became clear to me from looking at the photos and reading the correspondence that went with them, that in fact there was a kind of disdain on the part of the Batignolles that this was the kind of laborer that they had to deal with. And the hardships and the miseries that many of these workers experienced really got dismissed essentially as their own fault, a sign of the challenges that the French had to overcome to build this. So there's really not a level of sympathy for them, which creates a kind of dynamic that I think feeds into an exceptionally brutal and callous kind of regime and relationship between the colonial government, the Batignolles, and the workers.
And there isn't a lot, it seems, told from the perspective of or accounts written by the enlisted workers. That's just not.
That's true. I mean, the hardest thing, I mean, that one of the things I try to do, with a certain amount of painstaking effort is to try to piece together what the experience of various railroad workers were. And there are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can look at just the conditions under which they work. There are a lot of descriptions of housing, living conditions. You can look at the amount of food they ate, which was oftentimes, kind of lower than concentration camp rations in terms of calories. Occasionally, though, you do get these reports in which there are either interviews with local people, with Africans, or court cases in which there's like testimony. Occasionally, very occasionally, there's a kind of editorial comment that an African note taker will make on the notes. So it's hard to really get at these people's voice, as we say in the history profession. But it is there. I mean, I think there are ways in which you can kind of find it in very small fragments and try to bring it together.
This is a very intense and quite brutal story that you tell in this book. And I imagine that it was emotionally pretty challenging to spend years with this material. What was that like?
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, I don't think, I don't think that most people, I mean, I certainly don't, and I'm, a professional historian. I don't think most people realize the extent to which historians are affected by their material. And this really, it took a toll. I mean, it was emotionally extraordinarily difficult to work through some of these documents, to recreate the sorts of experiences that these people had. But I tried to do it, seriously and studiously. I tried to, for me, it was extraordinarily important not to sensationalize it in any kind of way, to be very sober, to have humility, I guess, because obviously whatever kind of, secondhand trauma I might have experienced, it was nothing like the experience of the workers themselves. But certainly it was difficult. And certainly it's a book that I'm glad I wrote, but I'm also kind of glad to be able to move on to something else.
Now you're going to do the Moulin Rouge or something, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I might. My wife is like, you must write a happy book. So.
You can alternate. But another intriguing moment in this book is that, I mean, of the grim things that happened and grim maladies that these workers got, is something that was like mysteriously kind of like an AIDS-like virus, which there isn't concrete evidence, it seems, that it was connected to AIDS. But I just wonder, is there also kind of a history of science angle here? What was that about?
There is, and I kind of came across that after starting looking at everything else. But there are a number of kind of epidemiologists, these biologists who kind of trace back the history of diseases, who have more or less speculated. And it's interesting. I think some of them are quite convinced that the Congo-Océan played a role in the history of the transmission of the HIV virus. As a historian, I have to be much more cautious and say, we don't have exact evidence. But it does seem from these scientific investigations that the moment of transfer of the HIV virus from a chimpanzee or a monkey to a human probably occurred in the early 1900s and probably in a region of what is now kind of on the border of the Republic of Congo and Cameroon. And this was a region that they definitely did a lot of recruitment in. And the speculation is that men with HIV were brought in the 1920s down to the railroad. The disease may well have spread there. And the reason why they make this connection is that, again, a kind of weird colonial story. There was a doctor who went to Brazzaville in the early 1930s who was really kind of bored. I mean, he didn't have much to do. And he decided to do autopsies on some of the men who had died on the railroad. And he found this disease that he ended up calling he called it myome, but myome is this mountainous region that was the most difficult part of the railroad, the myome cachexia, a kind of extreme wasting. Scientists can now look back at his notes and realize that much of what he describes very much parallels the kinds of impacts that AIDS has on workers. So particularly the way in which there's certain brain changes in the brain, certain loss of appetite, this cachexia, this extreme wasting. So I think it's quite possible that in addition to killing, tens of thousands of workers and causing untold brutality, it's quite possible that the Congo-Océan was an important early vector in the spreading of HIV.
That's really a fascinating and distressing, but fascinating development.
Yeah.
I guess more people moved around than would have otherwise if they just stayed in their little village.
Exactly. I mean, the important thing for the spread of HIV is that it not only develops in an area, but then it spreads to the rest of the world. And the way, it clearly is now seen as being in that region by the 1930s, again, around the time of the railroad. And then it remained fairly local until the 1970s is the theory now. And the idea is that Kinshasa, Brazzaville, that area of around the head of the Congo River was the important kind of point from which it spread around the world.
Do you find that after this intense research and writing this book, In the Forest of No Joy, about the Congo-Océan Railroad, do you feel like you have a different understanding of the French colonial project from this work than you did before? Where do you feel like, how does it help us kind of understand the larger scope of French colonial history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting. I think, we oftentimes think, I think many people, I mean, there's much debate now about the brutality of colonialism. Was it, and it oftentimes is pitched in this kind of, was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? I mean, there are defenders of colonialism for certain. And there are people who just portray it as horrific. I think that for me, the important thing was to try to get at the nuance and the detail. And perhaps this is why I'd spend so much time talking about the various experiences of these workers, of the various ways in which colonialism was violent. I mean, I don't think it was just purely about a violence against bodies, against people, although that was very much a part of it. I mean, it clearly was also a violence against communities, a violence against societies, against cultures, but also really a kind of violence against history. Because one of the things that the book tries to show is that, the way in which the French colonial government tried to control the story of the Congo-Océan pretty much effaced or erased the role of the African workers who actually built it and who certainly suffered through the construction of it in extraordinary ways. So there's a kind of way in which, there's a violence of empire against history itself that I think is definitely one of the takeaways from this story.
And you've done a really impressive job giving voice as much as possible to the experiences of these workers in this brutal railroad building project. Is there anything else that you would like to add or that you think that readers should understand and take away from In the Forest of No Joy about the Congo-Océan Railroad?
Well, I mean, other than read the book, that's a tough one. I think that we do need to think, I mean, for people who are interested in European history, and this is a question I get a lot, it's like, well, are you really a European historian? Which is how I was trained. It's what I write about for sure. I think we need to keep in mind that this is very much a part of European history. It's very much a part of French history in particular. And it's a part of French history that has really been kind of marginalized or denied until very, very recently. And I guess my hope for the book is that it shows that for as much debates as there are in France today about, say, Algeria, the sort of history of the Algerian War and so forth, there are many other parts of the world and many other episodes that are in need of kind of excavation and further discussion and further debate. I guess I hope that the book feeds that and sort of plays into a reassessment of what French history really is.
JP Daughton, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your book being on our Book Award shortlist. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been a joy for me too.